make a small addition, and then we can maybe go over to Mathieu because he has an idea about positive, negative, and neutral emotions. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that I think that maybe the fact that there is no obvious word for emotion in, say, Pali and Tibetan, coming from Sanskrit for this word, this concept emotion, may be a little bit of a red herring. It's not really, it doesn't really tell us anything. It sometimes seems to me that it's taken as implying that in Abhidhamma and in the list of so-called mental factors, emotion is not included. But in fact, all the, I mean, just as in the Sanskrit dramatic theory, they have this later word that they have emotion, and they give a list of 8 things that have emotion, rasa and these bhava. All of them are in practice included in the list of chaita in both Theravada and Abhidharma Kosha. So within the Abhidhamma, we have emotions, we have anger, joy, friendliness, envy, and so forth. So all those things are there. I think it's also important that there's a tendency in Abhidhamma, I think, to want to separate feeling from emotion. So feeling is something very, very simple. Any experience we have can either register as pleasant, I like it; unpleasant, I dislike it; neutral, I'm not sure what I think about this. And the point is then that feelings can be then associated with what would be considered kusala, wholesome emotions, or akusala, unwholesome emotions. So I can have a pleasant feeling when I'm sitting greedily eating my meal. That is pleasant feeling, but with the emotion of greed. I can also have a pleasant feeling when I am sitting talking to someone and the conversation is friendly. Then there is pleasant feeling associated with adosa, friendliness, metta. So I think there is quite a lot in Abhidhamma, in effect, about emotion.
When I suggested that it wasn't there, it was certainly not at all to imply that emotions aren't discussed, but simply that category of emotions, non-evil emotions. And I say I'm still not very, I mean, I'm perhaps asking for too much because the clarity is not present already, but just the notion of signaling what is significant and not significant. This is not a debate, it's not comparing one system to another, but I'm thinking of a data analyst simply going through some numbers, and for his particular agenda, he says, well, this is noise, but this is significant data. And utterly dispassionate, he might almost be bored to death. He's been doing this for 3 hours, and yes, significant data and not insignificant. And would you, and this is really simply a question, but is that still emotion?
So I think now we're playing on the meaning of the word significant as opposed to the meaning of the word emotion. I don't think anything that's significant in any context means it's emotional. But it is the case. I mean, we try to say what holds all these things together, this signaling system that is emotion. It's somehow telling you that this is important to you.
More now, existentially, like for your well-being, your survival,
yes.
Whether this is just your job getting $10 an hour.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. That's much clearer.
Yeah, there can be a lot of confusion about the word positive, negative, constructive, destructive. So we had a whole Mind and Life meeting on emotion, and subsequently with Richie Allen and Paul Ekman, which also tried to sort that out. So just in a nutshell, because we speak a lot of pleasant, unpleasant, positive, negative, when we say often in psychology, positive and negative is going towards something or averting or moving away from something. Of course, in Buddhist context, positive will be more happiness and negative more suffering or less happiness. So in that sense, we would say that the positive emotion is constructive toward flourishing and well-being, while another one is destructive. So it has nothing to do with attraction, in a way, with pleasant and unpleasant, because, as just said, a very pleasant momentary experience leading to hedonic happiness may in the end cause a lot of suffering, while sadness, for instance, which are very unpleasant, at the same time could be compatible with sukha, which is a way of being strong, free, within, compassionate, and all that, a sense of orientation in existence, which is compatible with genuine demonic happiness. So that's why we more use constructive and destructive emotion than positive and negative. And pleasant and unpleasant is quite superficial, because they could lead either way to suffering or happiness.
Yes.
So that's why we need to unpack all those from both perspectives.
I agree completely, and I think, as I mentioned briefly before, it's a real hindrance to Western science that we aren't being more clear about what we mean when we say emotion, because just as I did today, because that's the tradition, we say emotion does X, and it certainly isn't just emotion. There's more to it than that, and the fact that our language isn't meeting our conceptual understanding, not that would be easy to do, but it could be better than it is, I think is preventing us from thinking about these things in a detailed way that might be helpful.
Richie, you had something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to make one additional distinction that was relevant to Alan's question, and that is that there are systems in the mind and the brain for detecting emotional cues or emotional stimuli in our environment, and there are other systems for related systems for actually generating an emotion, and those are not necessarily the same thing, and so we can detect that an event or a stimulus is potentially significant, but that doesn't necessarily engender an emotional response in a person. The generation of an emotional response may be particularly important for motivating action, but that is from the perceptual process of detecting significant events.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah. So we did touch upon this, question of complexity of the processes when something like this, something like an emotion arises. So it's not just one thing that happens. And there are also a lot of implicit influences.
So, Yohani, when you are in these discussions with science and let's say with the Western notion of emotion, how do you conceptualize emotion coming from a tradition that has a different approach? Or as
no clarity.
Me too.
So still in a state of confusion or ignorance. So that brings more curiosity to listen. This because of that, this explanation like that. Oh yes.
I think that the points that both Mathieu and Rupert made regarding Rupert's distinction between feeling and emotion and Mathieu's emphasis on wholesome and unwholesome, I think this represents a very important challenge for Western conceptions of emotion in psychology and neuroscience. And we've been talking with you, Your Holiness, for many years about these issues, and it's slowly infiltrating mainstream psychology and neuroscience, but it's still the case that in our experiments, in the experiments of most Western scientists who are studying emotion, the fundamental categories are categories that are still, I think, confounding wholesome and unwholesome, because a positive feeling, as we heard, can arise in the context of an unwholesome situation or a wholesome situation. And that distinction, I think, may be crucial to the brain. That may help actually resolve some of the ambiguities in our own research. And I think that we need to take this dimension more seriously in the research that is being done in Western emotion science.
So just to follow up on what Richie said, I think, if it's important in behavior, I'll take it a step further. It definitely is going to be somehow represented in the brain in a way we can see. But I think the challenge for us scientists is to find a way to really define the concepts, what we mean, wholesome, unwholesome, and how we can verify that. Because for us, we have to understand the behavior and the psychological construct and be able to measure it before we can actually say anything about the brain. And this is, I think, in emotion, a huge challenge. Our ability to discuss it and conceptualize it and talk about the subtlety goes way beyond our ability to manipulate it and assess it and quantify it. And I think we're going to have to find a way to bridge that a little bit more before we're really going to get a hold of this in terms of the brain function.
So His Holiness's own personal feeling is that when we are doing science, basic science, analyzing what the mental processes are,
investigation,
on that level, he's wondering whether this evaluation of wholesome, unwholesome is actually a good thing or a bad thing, or relevant.
Is it even tractable?
Yeah, relevant.
Relevant.
따이네 단 남중아 저 wholesome 지야 데저트기 요 가족도가 unwholesome sam르드제기 레벨 가족도도 도저히 럽초로야.
Of course, that is separate from the other question, which is very scientifically open as well, which is to try to understand those types of emotions which we agree to be wholesome and what their behavioral expressions are and their effects and so on, and how are they expressed at the brain level. And those emotions which we generally recognize to be unwholesome, what their expressions are, what their behavioral outcomes are. That is, of course, a scientific question of investigation.
Then I think another thing, the demarcation, wholesome, unwholesome, not based on our common sort of concept. But you see, research, those emotions which bring inner peace, calm mind, and also as a result, the physical action, the verbal action become more peaceful, more nice. That brings more happiness on others' mind. And also ultimately, very positive was the impact in our body. Then we describe that is wholesome. Those emotions immediately disturb our inner peace, and as a result, expression, harsh.
Yeah, harsh words.
That also brings more uncomfortable on others, including animal, and ultimately very harmful for body. Yes. Then we demarcation.
Yeah.
Demarcation where?
That's how the demarcation should be.
That then consider unwholesome. So now here I think very complicated. In human mind, I think the justice, truthful, not double face.
Right.
That also, I think by nature, even to some extent, the animal also used to appreciate your honesty. So that also I think involved. Something brings some satisfaction or inner peace, but actually go against with
justice,
honesty.
No.
So ultimately, that brings some uncomfortable deep inside. So that should you see in the category of unwholesome. Although brings some pleasure. For the moment, some peace of mind, maybe
satisfaction.
Satisfaction. But ultimately, it may increase some uncomfortable. So that should bring unwholesome. And other, temporarily, a little bit uncomfortable. But still, you have truthful conviction. There's no need to take to say double stand, right? Double stand. That brings you inner strength. Clear? So I think complicated. These things are complicated.
So the point is, how do we draw the line between wholesome versus unwholesome? It should not be contingent entirely upon how it feels, but a sense of fairness and justice also need to play a role in that determination.
이 전주선배한테 러브전을 시대 dom돼야 돼. 동행이랑 강판탕. 대한 미죠.
So there's a wonderful summary in the Bodhisattva precepts on the trainings of the Bodhisattva where it says that
팬더 대화 남자야 돼. 대한 미죠. 동행이랑 강판탕 팬더 대화 남자야 돼. 동행이랑 강판탕. 구도. 팬더 대화 남자야 돼. 대한 미죠.
So in summary, it says the Bodhisattvas should act in the following. Even if it is painful to you, if it is, so having explained all the specifics of the precepts in the preceding section, and then there is a summary point where it says that the Bodhisattvas should act in the following. Even it is painful to you, if it is so first, he should engage in actions that are beneficial and joyful. So it's beneficial in the short term and leading to happiness in the long term.
따지네 동행이야 강판탕. 차도 동행이야 이나야. 풀 팽겨도는 대차고.
So even if it is painful, if it is beneficial, one should do it. So the idea here is that in the short term, even if it leads to some form of suffering, if in the long run it's leading to happiness, one should do it. So even it feels pleasant, if it is unhelpful, and then one should not do it. If it is hurtful, harmful, one should not do it. Here is again, in the immediate it may seem pleasurable, but if it is hurtful in the long term, a long run, one should not do it.
I think that was that concept.
That
I think cover all. I think for the universal value can pay to it.
So you would also, of course, tie in ethics into all that.
그래서
ethics 내용 걸어봤어.
맞아? 내가 ethics 안에 파시고 말다. 다 패마다 ethics래. 너버데 안 ethics래. 도스로다.
Well, that's not the way to look at this. The way to look at it is to actually...
There is no absolute
ethics, yeah.
It's no absolute good.
Yeah. It's not the case that you have first a set of ethics and then you bring it into your understanding of what is wholesome and what is unwholesome, but rather it's the other way around. You analyze the mental reality and find which is harmful and helpful, beneficial.
Long run.
And then on the basis of understanding that, then the summary kind of conclusion would be the ethics. But it's not the case that you are bringing ethics into the investigation of reality.
Of course, that's Buddhist viewpoint. Buddhist viewpoint.
Buddhist approach now. Buddhist approach.
Right.
Buddhist approach now.
Buddhist approach. Some of the theistic sort of tradition, little different. Okay, we must respect that.
Matthew?
So as you see from his earnest, actually there are ways to investigate that. And you can say short and long term. You can say the search of fluctuating hedonic pleasure, happiness, and the more deeper way of being of eudaimonic happiness. So this criteria can be applied, and not a dogmatic ethic of good and evil, but embedded contextual human-related situation of what brings suffering and happiness. So those are not vague ideas. I mean, we can really, if we see it from that perspective, I mean, there are ways to then consider emotion by their impact.
I had given Adele first.
I want to make a comment and then say what I wanted to say. The comment is that I think that Your Holiness has given us a way to look at it that makes it less complicated. Because you say, look at the effect on the body over the years. And that gives us an objective way to do it. So you have made it much less complicated. Thank you. What I was going to say, though, is there are other ways that are really important about how thought and language affects emotion to reduce suffering. And I thought that it would be helpful to mention this. Jamie Pennybaker has worked with people in communities that go through horrific events like a terrible flood or an earthquake, things like that. And he's asked people to just keep a journal, to just write about their experiences and their emotions. And he finds that that reduces their stress, improves their psychological well-being, but also improves their physical well-being. Now, many people will say if you go to a therapist or you talk to somebody who listens compassionately, but that's more complicated because you're also getting all the good things that come from the interaction. This eliminated the interaction. You're just putting it into language. And that in itself changed the way it's represented in the brain, the way it's experienced in the body and the mind. We know that it's much better to have a good attachment with your mother, your parents, than an insecure attachment. An insecure attachment leads to suffering later. But they've shown in studies that if you can come up in language with a coherent understanding of what happened when you were little with your mother, not making it right, not making it justifying it, but just coming up with some understanding of it, the outcome of people with an insecure attachment are just as good in adulthood as those with a secure attachment. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that it looks like the way this happens is that the prefrontal cortex dampens down the amygdala, as if the amygdala is kind of a fire alarm that keeps, saying stress, and you're not able to come up with some coherent way of addressing it. And just putting things into language changes how the brain deals with it and affects our psychological well-being and our physical well-being. I just wanted to mention that.
Diego, can I just step out of the interpreter's role and just make a simple point?
Absolutely.
Because the discussion came up about why there is this big sort of contrast between the Eastern classical Indian tradition versus the West with regard to whether or not there is a specific term for emotion and what that suggests. And here, perhaps, since we don't have Sean, I could play the philosopher's role. And also, one thing that is important sometimes is to bring the historical perspective. One thing that we have to understand is that Western science grew out of Greek thought. And this kind of dichotomy between passions and reason has been a very important ancient heritage of Western thought. And the concept of emotion as a separate kind of an entity has its root in this Plato's distinction between the three components of the soul, where passion has an important role. And there's often a conflict between passion and reason. Perhaps that may have been an important basis. And that kind of dichotomy was never really articulated in the Eastern context.
Can I respond to that?
Thank you.
passion, the reason,
Yeah, Liz?
So I think you're absolutely correct, and I think we see this now a lot when we talk about decision making. So in some of the neuroeconomic research that I've been getting into more and more, there's been this talk about emotion and cognition as two competing systems in the brain. And I think this is not a very sophisticated approach, but it's almost like in trying to talk about the approach where emotion integrates in many different complex ways, is such a hard hurdle to overcome in Western science because of this strong tradition that I think comes from the early philosophical writings about passion and reason being two opposing forces as opposed to interacting forces to allow us to arrive at the correct conclusion.
Thank you.
Make one point and then I'll pass it on to Dave.
I just want to make one point about this, which is I think that most neuroscientists today would agree that the brain does not respect the dichotomy that was handed to us by the Greek tradition.
Absolutely.
Greek.
I would like to bring attention back, at least briefly, to the notion of beneficial in the long term. So there are many people in the world, and often, on occasion, one is confronted with a situation where one can make a decision such that by taking Act 1, many people will be benefited somewhat. Their suffering will go down and their happiness will go up. But in contrast, one might make another decision instead that will improve the situation of fewer people, but to a greater extent. I might make a decision such that I can create enlightenment in a much smaller group of people while the suffering is worse and the happiness is less for the rest of the people. So you have a situation that involves a moral dilemma. Suppose there is a man on a bridge and I'm standing next to him, and if I push him off the bridge, I can save 5 people down below because his body will stop a train that's about to run into 5 people down below who don't see the train coming. What should I do? Should I sacrifice the life of the one man in order to increase the happiness of the 5 down below? How do I resolve all of this according to the precepts of Buddhism, compassion, and so forth, when I'm deliberating this and there's only 2 seconds to decide whether or not to push?
네. I think sometimes we have to think it very seriously from the theoretical viewpoint and the practical viewpoint. Sometimes there is sort of the contradictions.
Contradiction or conflict.
So using our common sense on the case by case.
Case by case. In fact, in Shantideva's text, there is basically a point raised that in the end, how one acts in a given situation. So how one acts in a given situation is that the person should really weigh what is the most appropriate thing to do in the end, because there's going to be conflicts, and Shantideva says that use your knowledge and act accordingly.
Still not my problem. From theoretical viewpoint, 대변인지쟁이 any 미 국제도 국주 고교 소교야 된다라 미직세.
From the theoretical point of view, in Buddhism, in fact, there is a discussion of this problem, and there is a story of a bodhisattva who was a captain of a ship.
One of previous sort of the life of
the Buddha. And in this ship, there was a murderer who was going to commit an act of killing all the passengers on the ship. And in order to save all the passengers, he had to kill this.
999.
No, 999 passengers. So in
order 1,000
people on the ship,
a group of people, 1,000. And out of 1,000, one person thinking to eliminate the rest of the people, then all the belongings or possess, you see.
He could take them,
So then the Buddha's, so the previous life is that. Then you see, judge, killing. Generally, I mean, one killing many, both bad.
Negative law.
Must avoid. But now there is no other choice. One person determined to kill the rest of his companion. He gave several warnings, but he never sort of dropped that sort of plan. Then that person, you see, calculate, if I kill this one person in order to save 999 persons' life, now here, important thing is, if he let that person kill 999
people,
then this person will get sin, killing,
negative karma.
Negative karma, 999 people, killing of
999 people.
If he, the Buddha's previous life, if he killed this person, he got the sin. But
Of only one.
Just so killing one. Then most important, 가사대 민한 동동쟁이 미국제도 구주 고고서야 뒷벌리 잡았다.
So from
민한 동동쟁이 미국제도 구주 고고서에 뒷벌리 잡아야 된다라 랑이기 미지세에 뒷벌리 당솔람.
So here you will have a situation where the bodhisattva, in order to save this potential murderer from committing a negative karma of killing 999 people, he willingly took upon himself the act of killing this one individual and taking the karmic consequences of that one murder.
자, 다디 라는 모멘트는 동ling 소리셔서.
So here, in a sense, what we have is a form of giving and taking, Tonglen practice.
근데 인도 안에 되게 안 되게 너무 이슈가 안 되셔야 돼야기 주주대 semgewala never me
Yes. So now to follow up on this, David, your point, earlier I cited that summary from a particular text after having listed all the Bodhisattva precepts. I did leave out one final line which says that for whose heart is pure or virtuous, and there is no sin. there is no fault.
So ultimately depend one's own ultimate motivation. Sincere compassion, sincere sense of concern of others' well-being. Usually you see this demarcation, right and good, usually is based on our egoistic attitude. This is someone who thoroughly trained the egoistic attitude, diminish, full of compassion, sense of concern of rest of the
others,
entire sentient being, then egoistic tone the right or wrong
So for that individual, then the demarcation that is normally drawn between what is right and wrong from a sort of a self-centered perspective no longer applies. So, in fact, there is a statement in Dodrup Jingme Tenpe Nyima, great Dzogchen master of early 20th century, where he says that in the context of discussing matters at the level of fundamental innate mind of clear light, don't bring in conversations that are on the level of coarse everyday consciousness.
전에 안데 준준 안에도 와 특징아와 링식베 깍번 남자 대단낭스.
So in relation to this, in Shantideva's text, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Bodhicharya Avatara, where he says that, talking about Bodhisattva's ethics, he says that given the far-sightedness of the great compassionate Buddhas, even those that have been conventionally prohibited from conventional norms were permitted to the Bodhisattvas.
So
in the case of this ethical dilemma, the ethical dilemma that you presented of the person who's standing up on the bridge and wondering whether he should push this other person down, first of all, that person needs to have cultivate bodhicitta, this altruistic. Then he will be able to know what to do.
That motivation, then okay. Whatever he done, okay. Kasa.
That's an option too.
Ka. Shush.
They ask that question in the lab about that dilemma. They say you cannot jump yourself. You have to push or not. But in real life, as is always said, then you would jump yourself. That's the only way.
No, but generally the ethical dilemma is where the person who's standing next to you is large enough so that weight of that person can block. Whereas if you jump,
you're not supposed to jump
to finish the scenario. No, that was the idea.
Yes.
That was the idea.
That you cannot say 100%.
Fine cliff.
Ultimately, motivation. That you can see. That's what I'm worried about.
Really. So if the person happens to be someone quite large, so that means he ought to jump himself.